a lot to cover this morning as we get going, and I know some of it will probably it's going to stir some questions and some thought, and we'll look at that for sure in the time that we have allocated for it. But I may not be able to answer everything that you have. We are talking this morning. The topic is a new experience, and last week we talked of the experience in the church, and also the experience that Moses and his wife and others through time, whether slaves are just or us personally, as people of color have experienced in terms of racism, discrimination, prejudice, and so forth, as it rears its ugly head, manifests itself in 1,000 different forms. We saw from it that anciently the God was not approving of it. Then he does not approve of it now. And today we're going to continue in that journey, as we looked at last week when we saw that he dealt with it in a very marked manner, as it was with Miriam. And even though we saw it with Miriam, we looked at the relationship that she had and the hierarchy in ancient Israel. And one of the ironic things is that when she was punished with leprosy. So their skin became white. And so the irony of it is that she was getting on Zipporah for having dark skin, and now her skin becomes white. And so it's just an irony that is there. And she learned from her mistake. She and Aaron, they repented. So thank God for that they learned. If we would just learn from some of the attitudes that we take, some of the positions that we occupy, and we would repent from that, then we would see the hand of God moving miraculously. And so she did. She learned from her mistake. And tragically, though, some of those things, they still exist, and we have to do better as a people. We have to be able to overcome them. Not only do they exist in the world, but sadly, they also exist in the church. And so when we see it, then we should be prayerful and to know and to seek by all means to be able to counteract that, because certainly it is not what God would desire, as is championed and made clear by the scriptures, and even his presence being made known that he does not approve of it today. So we're going to go back a little bit, and we're going to look at our topic of a new experience. And as we look through the lens, we want to look through a lens of how could such an evil institution of slavery be allowed to exist in this country and other nations. I don't know how far we're going to be able to get today or next week as we look at this. There are a lot of different things I want to talk about. I want to talk about some of the things you've heard with 1619, critical race theory, and so forth, and what people say. And what people say and what is reality, sometimes there's a big divide that's in between it. But I'd love to have the opportunity to be able to look at it. We'll just have to see how far we can get, how much time we have to allow. But one question that comes up that people will ask, and they say, well, how could racism, how could slavery exist in America, in what was to be a Christian nation? You know, we champion ourselves, pride ourselves off of being a nation founded under God. And the Declaration of Independence is certainly, it speaks of being endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice, pursuit of happiness, pursuit of justice. I don't know where that came from, but the pursuit of happiness. I guess the forefathers would be rolling over in their graves saying that. But you ask that and say, well, how could then these who held forth for this institution of freedom, how could they champion a cause of slaves? I mean, how could you have founders who would write such things that are as articulate as that, but still hold men to be subhuman, have men that were enslaved while they themselves are demanding freedom from the British Empire? How could that be? And I've shared with you, of course, that some people will try to make the notion then that this was a founding then of a Christian nation. And when you look at some of the influence of Thomas Jefferson, in particular, is looked at as being the author of the Declaration of Independence, that a lot of the ideas that he espoused and championed were not so much as Christian causes and such, but really those things that were instrumental to him from his time period in France. And when he begins to talk about certain rights, inalienable rights by the Creator and so forth, you find that you don't necessarily find a reference to God and so forth. And then when you talk of the freedom of religion as it relates, certainly you come out of the time period of persecution, come from the distinction that had dealt with the powers that the papal church wielded in Europe, as well as the powers that some of the Protestant churches was what they would be called, the mainline churches like the Church of England and so forth, the Anglican churches, of the persecution and the mistreatment they had toward others, and the notion then that this would be a place where you would have the right to be able to worship God according to the dictates of your own conscience. And be it known, though, that with the ideas of Jefferson, that really he was just seeking, look, if you want to worship, however you want to worship, that be the thing. It was not so much of a bastion of let's have Christians to worship Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, and so forth. But through and the teachings that he had fostered and understood in France, that many historians, you can certainly read about it, that many historians then state that essentially what he was saying is that he had come to an age of enlightenism, deism, and other ideas that if you want to believe or don't believe, then that's fine, but just don't judge me. That was really the idea. Don't judge me because you want to go to church on Sunday, you want to go to church on, on Sabbath, as it was called. Don't judge me because I don't want to go. Don't judge me because I want to worship differently. But it was in that bastion, though, that we really get the underpinnings of what would be known as freedom of religion in America. And that freedom means that that essentially that you're saying that, look, you have the right to worship however you want to worship. If you want to worship as a Wiccan, then you can do that. If you want to believe as an atheist, then you can do that. If you want to worship as a Hindu, you can do that. If you want to worship as a Muslim, you can do that. If you want to worship as a Baptist, you can do it. If you want to worship as a Catholic, you can do it. If you don't want to worship, if you want to be an atheist, then you can do it. You have the right to be able to do that. And this is, again, was contrary to what had been the established norm of societies for hundreds of years as related to the idea of worship and so forth. But in that premise, though, you see this looseness that is there of being free, and yet the enslavement of millions of citizens in this country. And the question that people would ask is, well, how could this take place in this nation then? If you say that you have this foundation of Christianity, and I think, again, go back and look at the history, and you will find that, yes, there were Christians that helped to found the country, but a lot of the ideas and so forth were certainly not necessarily Christian by any stretch of the imagination. But there were some that were Christians that espoused the idea of slavery. Well, how did they allow those two things to coexist between what they were doing and what was taking place? Well, we'll look at some of these, and we're not going to look at them in detail because there's a lot to cover today, as I've already mentioned. First, I looked at Abraham, and this is not in exclusive lists or all-inclusive lists as such. There are different reasons, but these are the salient ones. I looked at Abraham as the father of faith, and all the patriarchs, that they held slaves without God's disapproval. And so their reasoning was, well, if Abraham and these other guys had slaves and God didn't have a problem with it, then what about us? Canaan, who was Ham's son, was made a slave to his brothers. Genesis chapter 9, 24 through 27. This is the idea. We talked about the curse of Ham and before, but they based this was their reasoning. So I'm not stating that these are correct reasons, but I'm saying this is what their reasons were. The Ten Commandments mention slavery twice, showing God's implicit acceptance of it. So in it doesn't speak that he disavows it or disapproves it, but their reasoning was that he didn't say anything about it, that he allowed for it, etc. Slavery was widespread throughout the Roman world, and yet Jesus never spoke against it. He spoke and talked about many things, but he never said a word against slavery. Hence, their interpretation of it was that because he remained silent, then that meant that he apparently approved of it. Lastly, the Apostle Paul specifically commanded slaves to obey their masters. One reference, of course, in Ephesians 6. You can also see other references in Titus, Philemon, etc. So if Paul is telling people to obey their masters, slaves to obey their masters, then apparently and obviously slavery can't be a bad thing. So for those who wanted to take that position, they felt very snug in their religiosity, that they were able to go to church every week, every Sunday, and that the institution that they were practicing, that it was fine, it was justified. They felt they have justifiable reason. They had their Bible text to sustain them on this point, that you have multiple examples to be shown as to why slavery was okay, so that the scriptures in their mind supported the institution of slavery. They didn't see it as being evil because the Bible in their mind supported the very institution that they were practicing. In addition to that, Paul also had told Philemon to return back to Onesimus. And so you remember that the slave had run away and converted to Christianity, and Paul told him to go back to his master. And they used that then again as the impetus that Paul didn't say, hey, just come run with me or go somewhere else and just enjoy your freedom, but he sent them back to go to his master. So those are some of the things that are used as a foundation. In addition, they had other things in that morphed from that. They felt that slavery removed people from an ancient culture that worshiped the devil, that practiced witchcraft and sorcery and other evils. So in a word that they were doing then, the coloreds, the Negroes, the darks, the other N-word, they're doing them a favor. They're doing us a favor because they're taking them from dark Africa, pagan Africa, and they're allowing them to be able to be introduced to Jesus and to be able to be saved. So isn't that a good thing? That you're taking them from superstition and paganism, and that they're going to be worshiping, and if they don't know God and they worshiping these spirits, and they're going to die and they're going to burn in hell forever. So we brought them from there, and now we've been able to introduce them to Jesus so they can be saved. Secondly, it's looked at slavery that brings heathens to a Christian land where they can hear the gospel. The Christians masters provide religious instructions for their slaves. So they felt that this was an opportunity for them to be able then again to educate their slaves, to teach them about the Bible, to teach them about the gospel. Under slavery, people are treated with kindness, as many northern visitors can attest. So they often, again, they looked at what they were doing as if this is fine, that they treated some of their slaves good, that they were not all beaten, that they were not all hungry, that they were not all disheveled, that they were not all assaulted, that they treated some of them good, that in fact, they even let them go sometimes to the Sunday services to be able to hear so that their souls could be saved. Then that also, the slave holders would recognize that it was in their own interest to try to treat their slaves well, because they were, after all, commodity. And so if you don't kill them in 10 days of work, but you're able to let them live 5 years or 10 years, then you're able to recoup your investment. So you don't want to harm him. You don't want to harm him because you want him to be able, or she to be able to survive. And then ideally, the most ideal situation is you want them to be able to have children. So you can buy a male slave, buy a female slave, and have them to have kids. And now you've just increased your investment. This is how it was looked at. You just increase your investment. So you may have paid $4,000 or $5,000 for a slave, and now they have children, and they maybe have 5 or 6 kids. So now you have like 8 slaves, and you only pay for 2, and you begin to multiply this over and over. And so now this population of slaves goes up from 500 to 1,000 on the plantation. You can work more land and so forth. You don't have to pay them anything, just give them some food to be able to take care of them and so forth. But you're really doing a good thing, because it's not that evil what you're doing. You are helping the heathen. You're saving his soul. And the Bible supports slavery. This was their mentality. This was their thinking. So all these things were used then to justify and to condone their behavior and their response. Lastly, it was a notion then that in some circles that slaves were treated better than they would if they were working in the northern factories. So it was all justifiable by their beneficence that they were exercising towards people of color. Then there were social reasons for this evil institution. They figured that women were called upon to play a subordinate role. And you have to keep in mind that in the time period that this was written in, that this is before, your Susan B. Anthony's of the world, your women's rights and so forth. All of those things are just Johnny come lately. Women didn't have the right to vote. The only ones that were liberated and free were essentially wealthy white men in this country. Everyone else was subservient. And so in the context of scripture, they looked and saw that women had a role and that slaves also had a role, and that's really been ordained or stationed by God. And it's an institution that God was using to be able to provide for the destitute of Ham, those who have been cursed. Lastly, they talked that abolition would lead to slave uprisings, bloodshed, and anarchy. And they looked at different examples of history of such as the reign of terror in France as, hey, this is what will happen if you put down this institution. Lastly, there was a political rationale for this. They figured that Christians are to obey the civil authorities based on Romans chapter 13 and other passages. And that those that are in authority, they permit and they protect slavery. So basically, it's established in the Bible, it's ordained of God, and that magistrates are ordained of God. And if the magistrates approve of this practice, then who are we to object to it? The church then should therefore concentrate on spiritual matters and not deal with political ones, was their reason and their rationale. And they went so far as to think that people who supported abolition, in the words of James Thornwell, were atheists, socialists, communists, and red Republicans. Now, what is interesting about that is some of that same argument that you will hear even today. If people want to alarm, particularly Americans, if you want to scare Americans from something, just throw out the words socialism, communism, and so forth, and that scares Americans to listen to nobody. That's like saying curse words in many circles, and you can see then through history that is nothing that is new. You can put it out there, and people will then they will run because they're afraid of it. So these were some of the reasons then that were used to be able to justify this institution. But certainly God was still alive. God was still working, because in spite of the fact that people were using Bible texts out of context and that they were giving a profane representation of his name, God was still here. He was still looking at the suffering that was taking place to his children. And through various means, those that had been enslaved were now introduced to the gospel. I digress to say that there were many who came over who were Muslims, many who came over in terms of practice and faith were Christians. There were many who came over that were pagans. There were many who came over that practiced tribalism and so forth. But they learned one thing, and that was to be able to live, you had to be able to survive. You had to be able to do what was there. Freedom was not necessarily going to be an option. It was not going to be easy. So you had to find a way to be able to assimilate within the culture that you now found yourself in. Removed thousands of miles away from your homeland, from your tribe, from your family, and under the most grotesque and barbaric reasonings and so forth. We can talk about the horror of the Middle Passage, of the countless that were sick and that died and that never made it over. And you look at America not just being a place in the new world of slavery, but all through the Caribbean and so forth. In fact, the bulk of those who came from the west coast of Africa didn't come to America. The vast majority ended in the Caribbean and other nations that are in Latin America, Brazil, and so forth. So not the majority came to America. We look at the institution of North America, but all of it was evil. This slave trade and its impact in the world and what the world was benefiting by it, this evil and injustice. And yet God is looking again upon the compassion, upon the suffering of a race that appears to be forgotten and to be abandoned by man. Well, as time would have it, as the slaves were now in America and beginning to assimilate into practices and so forth, and they would hear about the gospel. And some of these folks, again, they come from different backgrounds, and they're now assimilating. And it becomes quick and apparent that there are some churches that are going to be open to accept people, open to accept blacks into to fellowship by baptism. And so when you look at the idea of baptism, this again was a main thing for many who were big practitioners of slavery, because they looked at it as being able to liberate the soul of the black man. Mark chapter 16 and verse 15 says, "And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." So as time went on, the many slave holders would allow their slaves to be introduced to various elements of Christianity. And I will put that in air quotes, elements of Christianity, not the totality of Christianity, but the elements of it. They would let them hear what they wanted them to hear, i.e. the passages that spoke about their subservience, of their surrendering, them obeying, them being inferior, those types of things. These were doctrines that were inculcated into their psyche so that they would know and they would learn. They can learn about Jesus, but you can learn about Jesus, but you must accept your place in society and be a slave. And this was fitting. to them, in that now Mark tells us that the gospels go to every creature. But there are other passages, though, that spoke clearly, unequivocally. In Paul, he says in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 28 that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. You probably could figure out that this would create a challenge for the church, because you've gone and you shared on plantations. People have heard, they've attended and gone with the master and so forth. And now they've heard some of these different messages, and they've accepted, sometimes not renouncing everything that was of the world, but they would bring it into their churches. The Catholic faith would allow the intermingling of what may be paganism or tribal religion into Christianity, like this syncretism, bring it all together. Whereas more the Protestant churches, they would say, well, you can't bring that in. This is the way that it is, and it has to be. But a problem that took place even of a bigger picture, that now if you accept the slave and allow them to be able to be baptized, what do you do about their membership? How do you treat them and interact with them? Because is he still your slave, or is he your brother? Is he still the one that you can beat? Still the one that you can rape? Still the one that you can assault? Still the one that you can treat like property? Or do you have to treat him or her as God would have them to be treated? And they have to wrestle with that particular question. And you'll see this question fomenting in time. But as they initially deliberated upon it, it became very clear that some felt that, okay, this entitled the slaves in to be free. They ought to be freed because they can't be held in bondage. You know, it's one thing you can say with a heathen, yeah, he's a heathen, he should be a slave. But now you're saying that he's a believer, she's a believer, she's a brother, or he's a brother and sister. Well, the Virginia Assembly in 1667 had something to say about it. This is what they voted. So whereas some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth or by the charity and piety of their owners made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism, should by virtue of their baptism be made free. It is enacted and declared by this grand assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom, that diverse masters freed from this doubt may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, those slaves, or those of greater growth, if capable, to be admitted to that sacrament. In other words, what the Virginia Assembly says that, hey, we don't care if you are accept the gospel or not, you still are a slave. That does not change your status. It does not make you free. You're still bond. And with that, then it gave free license to go into evangelize, to go into share, because it's not going to change your status. And so if you're a slave owner, then you don't mind the gospel being preached to your slaves, because this is not going to liberate them. This can give them the gospel. This can help them to be free. This can help them to be saved, but it also can help them to be a better servant then. Because the sermons that you're going to hear are going to be those that are all dictated around a certain element of being subservient unto the master, of listening to the master, not fighting the master, not poisoning the master, not seeking to have a rebellion to cause disruptions in what's taking place on the plantation. So it behooved the slave master then to want the slave to be able to be educated and to be enlightened in the things of the church as the church taught at that particular time, with respect of slavery. So there was no risk to them whatsoever. But that was built upon the notion that if slaves were to assemble, that they would have specific ministers. You know, you're not going to have anybody just come by and to talk to them. You want specific people that you know what they're going to say, when they're going to say it, how they're going to say it, and what they're going to talk about. The biggest fear is you have an uprising of 1 million plus people that have been in bondage, that they might join hands and arms together and that they might revolt. So you would have specific ministers who will come and to share. In addition, you would have no religious meetings for slaves. So slaves couldn't have their own meetings. If they did have a meeting, it would be those that would be approved and sanctioned by the master, with someone being able to see what was being said. And if there was anything that was being out of line or untoward, that would be a problem. Now, keep in mind, again, that the sermons and those things which were shared had to be of a specific nature to teach the subservient position of the black to the white. In 1804, thereabouts, the slave Bible was introduced to the Caribbean. This was given to Caribbean slaves because, again, you wanted to do something to be able to help these ignorant, heathen black folks. And so this slave Bible, there are a couple of copies of some that are still available and left today, and mostly at museums as such. But when you look in the slave Bible, you find that it's really mutilated. And it's called the Bible, but it is not the Bible. In fact, as you maybe can see, it says parts of the Holy Bible selected for the use of the Negro slaves in the British West Indies and so forth. So these were particular things because you want them to be, enlightened. You want them to learn, to be able to be saved. But interestingly enough, the slave Bible, it doesn't include Moses leading the Israelites to freedom, but it does include Joseph's enslavement in Egypt. Why is that, you may ask? Well, you don't want to read about God telling Moses to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. That they've been oppressed in Egypt and they should be let go and be sent to freedom. And Pharaoh would not respond, and he continued to harden his heart. And God would send plague after plague. And Pharaoh would say, all right, go. And then he'd change his mind and say, no, don't go anywhere. And this happened over and over until finally God drowned the Pharaoh and the Egyptian hosts. And he brought Israel, a nation of slaves. He brought them out free into a nation of Canaan. Well, that's not going to work. You don't want that. Because that's going to stoke hope in people. That's going to help them to look to God now as being a deliverer. It's okay to look to God as being the one who would tell you to obey the master, but to look to God being the one to say, I want deliverance, and to leave your paganism or your idols and so forth that you worship to be able to worship God. I want you to know these parts, and so numerous passages in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament were taken away. Those things that were left were those that would give the countenance that God approved of slavery. So there would be no threat to this institution whatsoever, was the idea that they had in mind. They wanted to be able to have their cake and to eat it too. So the slave Bible lasted for some time that they began to share that, but it certainly had its major shortcomings in it. For slavery to continue to exist, these certain items were contraband, to have illegal meetings, to have what would be illegal preachers. And really these were like slave preachers coming in and sharing the story, because as time would go on, people began to hear other stories in the Bible of deliverance, of freedom, of perseverance, of hope, of God sending judgments upon the oppressor and being on the side of the oppressed, of God picking up the despondent, being a father to the fatherless, assisting the people to be able to establish them, to give them freedom, to bring judgment down, to bring deliverance. Their songs now became illegal because they looked at these as being methods of being able to communicate and to send evils. And so it was a lot of taboo when you talk about Africa. They looked at this as being a heathen nation as such. These are savages that had to be watched. And some people, unfortunately, they still feel like that today. But this was more of the mindset, the strong mindset that was there, that these are, heathen, these are savages and cannibals that will cook you, eat you up for dinner. They have no knowledge of God whatsoever. And some even felt the no redeeming qualities that were there. Not understanding, of course, when you look back at the ancient scrolls, that you see that amongst every nation that God has always had people. That you look back and you see that the Queen of Sheba sent over and came to the court of Solomon and looked at all the wisdom that he had. As you look at the experience of Jeremiah when he was thrown into the pit, and Abed-Melech, a black man, reached down out of the pit and worked to be able to extricate him. You look back at Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Jesus when nobody else would want to carry it, again, a black man. When everybody else was afraid and fearful, he stepped forward and he willingly volunteered. He was not compelled to do it. He wanted to do it. He wanted to, with honor, to be able to carry the cross of Jesus because he had heard about this man. You look at the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch and other stories, and we see that there's a plethora. Zipporah, we talked about, a plethora of people of color believe in the gospel. Even so much that there is a tribe in Africa that traces their ancestry all the way back to the Jews. Tribe today that still keep Sabbath, and they tested them with their DNA to be able to see, is this just make believe or is this hogwash? What's the reality of it? And they found out that there's a close parallel that is there, and the idea is that when the Queen of Sheba came back and began to share that there are people who understood, and we know through history, certainly in the middle of the Dark Ages and so forth, when Europe were worshiping gods of wood and the stones and stocks. The churches of Ethiopia and Abyssinia, they remained faithful and steadfast to God. They continued even in the midst of the apostasy when the churches fell away and began to embrace the teachings of the man of sin and the sacredness of Sunday. These still remain true and steadfast and remain faithful. Why? Because God has always had a people on every nation, every continent, them that fear him, them that love him, those that will make a covenant with him by sacrifice. So these teachings, they begin to become more apparent to those who were trying to deal with this premise that was there. But the slave holders, they didn't want them to sing. They didn't want them to have any type of thing that was reminiscent of Africa, the country that they had been stolen from. Their identity was to be taken from them, and they were to be merged into a new identity that was here in America. And it was simply, if you want to survive, if you want to live, you must learn to go along and to do things as what they are told. But there was a spirit in man that could not be suppressed. So they would meet illegally, despite the beatings. They'll come together after working in the field, and they would come and have their praises and so forth, and they would sing. They would sing songs that they would hear of stories of deliverance. And they began to put these things together and to communicate them. And this was more so impressive because of the fact that many of the slave masters began to notice that there was sometimes that blacks had a way of communicating through drums. They could play out a certain chord, and then after a while, maybe the chicken house would catch on fire. Maybe somebody would die. Someone would be poisoned. So they said, well, hey, we're going to outlaw all those things, because they recognized that this was a method of being able to communicate. And of course, this was done back in the motherland. You would be able to use this method of communicating and so forth to others. They said, no, we don't want any of those things here. We want all those messages to leave and to be gone. And yet, God has always had a plan. He has still worked to watch out for his people. So they continued to tell them that these things would not be acceptable. So the singing was outlawed. The harmonies and the melodies they had were illegal. It was, of course, against the law to be able to teach a slave how to read and write. Understand that some who came over who were Muslim understood how to read and write. Others who came from other tribes that were not Muslim, they generally didn't read or write. They were told they couldn't have writings. This was all contraband, because if a person read that, they might want freedom. They may want to be free. The pushes that continue to go on as more and more slaves then began to learn of Christianity. Something else happened then in the 1700s again, and then in the 1800s. In 1700s, phenomenon began to take place in Europe as well as in America. And this is known in history as the First Great Awakening. And preachers by the name of Whitefield, George Whitefield. You can think of Jonathan Edwards and others. They began to have a fervency to be able to preach and to share the gospel. And this was done because in the main churches and the established churches that it just seemed like the church had lost its spirit. It was no passion that was there, no pathos, no energy, no excitement, nothing that was there. It became dry and formal and rigid. And through this praying and desiring to be able to see a new life being breathed into the church, you enter into a period of the First Great Awakening, again, the late 1700s. And in the First Great Awakening, notice what George Whitefield says regarding it. It says, Father Abraham, whom have you in heaven? Any Episcopalians? No. Any Presbyterians? No. Any Independents or Methodists? No. Whom have you there? We don't know those names here. All who are here are Christians. Oh, is this the case? Then God help us to forget your party names and to become Christians in deed and truth. So what Whitfield was really teaching at was he was going against denominationalism, the idea of separatism, of people really believing that they exclusively were the only ones to be saved. And rather, he is teaching again that listen, you need to be a believer, you need to be a Christian first. That's what's important. You're not going to be in heaven segregated based upon denomination, a case, or a caste. You're going to be in heaven based upon the fact that you were born again. And so he began to share these things. This is an idea that was there. Again, the fervency that was communicated that he broadened. And then about 60, 70 years later, another preacher, Charles Finney, during the Great Second Awakening. And the Great Second Awakening, now this takes place in the time period we talk about as the Millerite movement and so forth, where now the church is now, it had fallen back into a slumber. Now it is being awakened again. And the church is now hearing again the steering call of God to repentance and to revival and to reformation. Now, as this is taking place, slaves are also hearing these things. They're also becoming accustomed to some of these things. And so it is spurring them in their religious excitement. It's spurring them in their lives. Charles Finney said, another thing to be avoided is an attempt to take neutral ground on this subject, speaking of slavery. He said, Christians can no more take neutral ground on this subject since it has come up for discussion than they can take neutral ground on the subject of the sanctification of the Sabbath. It is a great national sin. It is a sin of the church. The churches, by their silence and by permitting shareholders to belong to their communion, have been consenting to it. All denominations have been more or less guilty. Although the Quakers have of late years washed their hands of it, it is in vain for the churches to pretend it is merely a political sin. I repeat, it is the sin of the church to which all denominations have consented. They have virtually declared that it is lawful. The very fact of suffering slaveholders quietly to remain in good standing in their churches is the strongest and most public expression of their view that it is not sin. For the church, therefore, to pretend to take neutral ground on the subject is perfectly absurd. The fact is that she is not on neutral ground at all. While she tolerates slaveholders in her communion, she justifies the practice. And as well might an armed enemy of God pretend that he was neither a saint nor a sinner, that he was going to take neutral ground and pray, good Lord and good devil, because he did not know which side would be the most popular. Charles Finney and others pushed and demanded then that this system be addressed. He was saying, in effect, you can't have a race of people enslaved and say that you are a believer. It can't be. How can the church condone this and say that slavery is wrong, and yet you be a member? And as the sharing is going, he's dealing now not only at the salvation of men, but what we would call abolitionism, of striking out against the very institution itself, showing that it is sin in very clear tones, describing that it is sin. Now, this is having an effect again upon the minds of thinking people as people are reading things and seeing and becoming aware of stories through Harriet Beecher's Uncle Tom's Cabin, other books and so forth that are coming out expressing the disgust that's taking place under this institution of slavery. And again, in the South, it was practiced. In the North, it was more tolerated or permissive because the cotton that was picked in the plantations was shipped up north to be processed and to be worked in the factories. And so it was more or less an agreement that was being worked out, almost a wink-wink situation. But these preachers are coming forth saying, no, this is sin. This is sinful. It's a sin in the South. It's a sin in the North. Wherever it rears its head, this is wrong. So things begin to stir up as blacks are hearing the discussion that's taking place. As they're coming in and they hear about Jesus, they begin to hear some of these other stories that are there. While this happens, and they are learning, there's also the reality that they are expressing themselves and they're joining together in worship and singing, even though it had been forbidden. Them meeting together, the stories that they tell, the songs and so forth. Please don't forget that at the same time you had slavery in the South, you had also some free blacks that were in the North. And so they're coming through and they're beginning to bring in their experiences, their stories, their songs. And it creates a division. It creates a division because people begin to look and say, well, hold it. Wait a minute. We're so glad that you are freed and sanctified, but you can't come in here with those things. Those are like, witchcraft and it's, the African and so forth. Ooh, that's bad. We can't do that. The mindset again was you had to be able to survive, to be able to live. Now, if all you saw and if all you heard about people or saw of a culture was bad, what would you think? So to illustrate which, take a look at some of these photos and you'll see maybe a glimpse of what I'm talking about. This is an underpass area, not the clearest picture, but an underpass area. You can just see a bunch of homeless folks, tents and so forth that are set up. You can see police and crime tape and so forth. And this is these areas in Los Angeles. This is the beach. You can see panhandlers and so forth. Now, if I said to you, who wants to go to LA? And those are all the pictures that you saw. You're probably like, I think I'll pass. Let's change the page. These are the different pictures that you probably are accustomed to seeing from Africa. Pictures of starvation, sometimes wars between nations, witch doctors, people who are naked. Now, if I said to you, well, what's your picture then of Africa? And that's all you saw. And you're like, well, I don't have any part of that. Just the same as you looked at Los Angeles or so forth, or I can pick out any city and do the same thing. Like, no, I don't want to go there. And that's based off of the perception, based off of what you've seen, based off what you've been told and what you have been exposed to. And so if that's all that you see, then you'll come certainly to be able to view it in that particular light, even though that may not be the reality. As it relates to the Black experience, to this new experience, so they start coming into the church. They bring in the church their own singing, their own songs, their own experience that they bring forth. One of the churches that was certainly quick to receive were the Methodist church, other persuasions and so forth. Of course, you have the AME, which ended up splitting off because of racism, the African Methodist Episcopal Church as such. But you have that in every denomination, that you had these splits almost in every denomination, the splits between Northern and Southern and so forth. That's how you have, your Southern Baptists, etc. So you have the Methodist era. This is a book that was published in 1819 by D.E. Fenton. And this is called The Methodist Era, or Friendly Christian Advice to Those Methodists who indulge in extravagant religious emotions and bodily exercises. So he is talking against what he perceives as a danger. Notice what he says on page 28. He says, we have too a growing evil in the practice of singing in our places of public society worship, merry airs, adapted from old songs, to hymns of our composing, often miserable as poetry and senseless as matter, and most frequently composed and first sung by the illiterate blacks of the society. Thus, instead of inculcating sober Christianity in them who had least wisdom to govern themselves, lifting them into spiritual pride, into an undue estimation of their usefulness, overlooking to the counsel of Mr. Wesley, who has solemnly expressed his opinion on his book of hymns as already amply sufficient for all our purpose of rational devotion, not at all regarding his condemnation of this very practice, for which, among other things, he actually expelled 3 ministers for singing poor, bald, flat, disjointed hymns. And like the people in Wales, singing the same verse over and over again with all their might 30 or 40 times, to the utter discredit of all sober Christianity, neglecting to the counsel of Dr. Clark in this matter, never to sing hymns of your own comprising in public. These are the very words of injunction of our own discipline, unless you be a very first-rate poet, such as can only occur in every 10 or 20 million of men's, for it argues incurable vanity. Okay. Basically what he is saying is this. He's saying, look, how are you as dignified white folks singing like these ignorant black folks. You need to teach them. They don't need to teach you. The sounds and the music and so forth, we have a standard that is there. So how can you let them come in and sing this? We have our hymns that have been given to us by Mr. Wesley. Of course, you talk about John and Charles Wesley, thousands of hymns they wrote, wonderful hymns. That we had this is all we need. So how are you singing something else when we have these things that are here? Let me share the example of others who have been put out because they have encroached upon singing other songs and so forth. So this created a series issue. Created an issue that you have these blacks coming out, and now fast forward from the Civil War and blacks beginning to come into the churches in droves. What are these different things that have taken place? Because the idea is that, okay, if this is all paganism and so forth and idolatry, and we have what we have, and what we have is good enough. It is oftentimes the argument of the ignorant that will just say, let's just go back to the way things were. There's often the argument of the uninformed that will say, well, let's just figure out what the forefathers did, and that's good enough. In every age, when there has been a change, that has been the cry of the masses. Others have said, well, what's wrong with moving forward? What's wrong with advancing? What's wrong with changing something? And certainly, no one is saying to change something that is, or to adopt something that is wrong for the sake of changing. But there's some who feel threatened because of change, because they don't understand it. And so in this particular area that we find ourselves in, as we continue in the presentation on the new experience, it a lot revolved around then the notion then of music and the experience of these blacks coming into the church. And so you have blacks now entering the church in droves, and they're coming with it, particularly out of the experience of slavery. And a church that in many respects may be rigid or formal, and sometimes lifeless, not always, but they're bringing forth their experience. And many things are looked at just as simply, well, because this is from black folks, this is wrong, this is evil. And so it would certainly create friction and would create a problem that would invariably need to be addressed. And some would say, well, let's just stick to the old ways and get back to our roots. Well, what if your roots are messed up? Sometimes people don't want to change some things because they're afraid. They're afraid of what does change mean? What does it necessitate? You must understand that in life and in anything, white does not mean right. And old does not mean right. Tradition, well, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way it's always been since I was a kid. That doesn't make something right. Coming from Africa doesn't make it wrong either. And nor does coming from Europe make it right. If you could act white, would you be accepted? This was the attitude that they were thinking. So in there, the songs that they wanted to sing and they talked about, you find a lot of expressions about Jordan. You find a lot of expressions about Canaan and so forth. This was their experience because they would sing in their music that would bring emotion into it because of the experience that they had, the hope that they had, and all for the suffering. The preaching that they would hear was not really what you would call just turn to the scriptures because they didn't know how to read. And so it was many times reciting stories, telling stories of deliverance, of Israel, of the punishment of the wicked, the vindication of the righteous. This oral tradition was passed down. And one of the huge things that was also prevalent there was the call and response, which is, you see it very much played out then in the experience of people of color. And it really had like three components to it, like music and the congregation and the preacher. Probably best seen in many First State churches. And you think of the sermon, or maybe a speech, you want to call it, that Martin Luther King, when he was speaking at the March on Selma, when he goes into the, how long, not long, evil shall not always sit on the throne, Rome shall not always sit on the throne, and it says, how long, not long. Why is that? Well, that's because the people, generally speaking, coming back from slavery, they're not reading, they're really not literate. And so they would get the word and being able to respond, and they're now being brought into it. And so you have this cadence that he goes through, say, how long, not long. And he might ask the question and then they give the response. And so you see it brought out in many religious services as such, as a part of the experience. Now, again, those things, when you went into a church, people weren't accepting that. That was taboo. You were to come in to sit, to listen, and that was the extent of it. No amen, no hallelujah, nothing like that. That was completely germane. That was out. That was like to act as though the heathen did, or the unchurched. But that was a part of the human experience. And when you start reading in the Bible, the book of Psalms and so forth, we're told, you enter into God's courts with praise, to his presence with thanksgiving. You're able to come forth, and yes, you recognize he is holy, you recognize he is sovereign. But certainly in the house of God, you ought to be, if you're excited, something resonates with your spirit and feeds you, you ought to be able to say amen. You ought to be able to give expression to that. Well, in it brought something up of syncopation in the music. Now what we have been told, and this is something that is particularly prevalent in most Adventist circles, that there's 4 beats in a measure. And we talk about what syncopation is, and we talk about it's 4 beats in a measure. And I remember hearing it from different ministers and teachers and so forth. And I would say that my best experience, probably in school, one of my best experiences was working on my bachelor's from Oakwood. And I say that because, of course, I did a bachelor's at Heartland, but it was unaccredited, and I needed to have an accredited institution. And so I basically put my credits there at Oakwood and started there, and then ended up working later on my master's. But it was at Oakwood that I had a problem. And the problem is that you had to have a music appreciation class. And I looked to say, you know what? I've done music. I did choir for 3 quarters. What are you talking about? So I sent the folks, the registrar, all my information and so forth. He said, no, you need to have a music class, a music appreciation class. Why do I need a music appreciation class? I'm not trying to sing. I just want to get my credits, I get my degree and move on. And she said, well, you need to have an understanding of music, that goes beyond this, because really what I had done is in the music class, we just sung, we sung carols. I shouldn't say carols, but hymns and other pieces and so forth. That was pretty much the extent. She's like, no, you need to, it needs to be more diverse. You need to know about jazz and so forth. I'm like, but jazz? Why do I want to know about jazz? Probably the same as maybe what you're thinking. So anyway, I said, okay, well, hey, I got to do what I got to do. I got to take the class. So I enrolled at ARC and took the music class. And what I found very interesting, and maybe I had learned it as a kid, but just forgotten from so many years. What I found very interesting is as you started going through the history of music, that there are distinct periods in histories of music. You can go from the Baroque period to the Renaissance and so forth. You go from people who are just one person singing in the early church, like in the hundreds, to maybe 2 people singing, then 4, and it begins to change, and all these dynamics and how music and instruments start coming in, and I begin to go through and to learn a little bit more about music. So I learned quite a bit from it. One thing, 2 things that stood out to me. One is that in every age, when a new genre of music was introduced, there was always pushback from the established church. And I'm not saying this to say go listen to any and everything. That's not what I'm saying, but just follow the point and understand. There was always pushback because people are like, well, we didn't sing that when I was a kid. Oh, you're trying to make the church like the world. That was what the argument always has been. And that is what the argument always will be. So as I begin to learn back and look at some of the history of music, it challenged against some of the thinking and some of the things that I had been exposed to personally. And some of them, of course, I have shared with you, and others you've probably heard. But one of the big notions that I found out is in regard of syncopation. And what I learned, what I had previously learned and taught and shared, is that, well, in syncopation and music, you have like 4 beats in a measure. And we were taught, and I say we, talk about in many circles in Seventh-day Adventism, is that there's a natural stress that's on the first and the third beat. We prefer those to being the strong beats. And then we said that there's no emphasis on the second and the fourth beats, and those are like the unnatural beats. And so we talk about this natural versus unnatural. And that if you have syncopation, then that's when you place an emphasis on the weak beats, i.e. the second and the fourth beats, okay? So that was really like the basis of it. Yeah, 4 beats in a measure. First and the third were like the natural. And if you stress the second and the fourth, then that was syncopation. And that was pretty much, okay, I heard that's, okay, well, hey, that's simple enough, that's easy enough. And, and that makes sense. And it sounds good, but I'm here to let you know that that's not what syncopation is, though. So just let that sink in for a moment. That is not what syncopation is. That's an uninformed description of syncopation by people who don't understand music. And it's similar to different things I heard. I was listening to a health presenter the other day, and he was talking about cancer and talking about plant protein. He said, listen, you get cancer from meat. Meat is high fat, high protein. And you get cancer also from basically plant protein, like tofu or whatever. It's high fat, high protein. Because you got your high protein and you fry it and you have high fat and your body knows no difference between it. And that sounds good. It's like, okay, well, that's a statement of the unfortunately ignorant and the uninformed. And I can say that because I've said similar things. And when I said them, it's the statement of the ignorant and of the uninformed. And that your body knows no difference between them and so forth, the ideas and so forth that's propagated. So there are different things that are propagated, and in the bastion of it, the history of it, it will tell us something different. And one of my favorite statements is that truth loses nothing by investigation. Well, if we take the notion that syncopation is such, is that if you have the emphasis on the second or the fourth beat, then we have a problem, because you have the song like "Just As I Am" that's written in 6/4, not 4/4. Does Jesus care? Songs we sing all the time. It's in the hymnal. That's in 6/8. Blessed Assurance is written in 9/8. Then in 3/4 time is a song is Sweet Hour of Prayer. Well, let's look at what the encyclopedia tells us about syncopation. So syncopation in music is the displacement of regular accents associated with given metrical patterns, resulting in a disruption of the listener's expectations and the arousal of a desire for the reestablishment of metric normalcy. Hence the characteristic forward drive of highly syncopated music. Syncopation may be affected by accenting normally weak beats in a measure, by resting on a normal accented beat, or by tying over a note to the next measure. In other words, syncopation is not the myth that we have of the second and fourth beat. Okay, you can have an emphasis on the second and fourth beat, but really what it's saying is this: it's a syncopation in layman's term, is that you having an emphasis where you don't expect it. So then, if you have 4 beats in a measure, and you expect the beat or the emphasis to be on the first and the third, and you have it in the second and the fourth, then that's syncopation. The converse is also true. If you expect it to be on the second and the fourth, and you have it on the first and the third, then that's syncopation. If you expect it to be on the first and it's on the second, then that's syncopation. If you're expecting it to fall upon the first and the fourth, and it falls on the second and the third, quote, that is syncopation. What further do we learn from this? And this is from Dr. Lillian DeHunk. She is an Adventist professor. She says syncopation is generally explained as a musical feature that was first brought from Africa by slaves and later became a major ingredient of jazz and rock music. You've heard that before, where the syncopation that came from the slaves, they were using this in their voodoo, and they brought it over to Louisiana, and it came in, and it became an integral part of jazz and rock, and then it made its way into the church and to gospel music. And you've heard that before. Well, again, let's look back at history. Well, first we learned that syncopation is not what we were told it was, but let's look at the history and the transference then. It says it is generally believed or explained as a musical feature that was first brought from Africa by slaves and later became a major ingredient of jazz and rock music. Because of this perspective, syncopation has been understood as intricately tied to heathen animistic practices and interpreted as an instrument of evil. For this reason, it has often been shunned by the church. In other words, people say, well, hey, syncopation, this came from Africa. The reality of it is that historians will say that syncopation didn't come from Africa. Well, I'm going to repeat that again. That they would tell you that syncopation didn't come from Africa. Get harmony from Africa, but not syncopation. That syncopation came from Europe, and that you would see it exhibited in different songs that are there in the antiquity of Europe. Okay, but we reason that this came from Africa, and like those pictures I said, if that's all you saw was bad, then you would think, oh, well, if it came from Africa, ooh, it's got to be bad. This has to be evil. And so for this reason, it's often been shunned from the church. An objective and historical study of the practice of syncopation on one hand, and the traditional rhythmic practices characteristic of African music on the other hand, revealed that the situation is not this simplistic and that such an explanation of syncopation is outright erroneous. Syncopation, on the other hand, has been a basic rhythmic feature of Western Europe music since the dawn of polyphonic music in the Middle Ages. To come closer to our ties, the rhythmic principle of sacred or secular Renaissance music from the 15th and 16th centuries by composers such as Johann das Prez, Heinrich Isaac, Orlando de Lassus, Giovanni Perluga de Palestrina is strongly governed by the practice of syncopation. In other words, she's talking about that there are plenty of classical songs that are governed by syncopation. Any sacred music written in those times, whether a motet or mass, features abundant use of syncopation. And that's from our book, In Tune with God. Okay. So it created a challenge then. And so there are many who would then just join the bandwagon and say, well, it came from Africa and so forth. Well, no, that's not the case. So, well, it's an evil song and so forth, came from Africa and it's voodoo and so forth. That's not what the history bears out and attests to. Time permitting, would definitely love to give an example of maybe syncopation, because you can just easily change a song and it could be syncopated. You could sing This Little Light of Mine, and you could change it. Any song you can, easily add to it. Like if you're happy and you know it, clap your hand, you can just speed it up, slow it down and so forth. And then just quote, syncopate it. But their experience, they had to find a way to bring their experience so the people may be strengthened and enlightened because they were going through a struggle. I share those things as well because when they began to present those songs and to sing, many times they were rejected, they were ostracized. And so it created further alienation to a people that were already broken and hurt. So they would begin to sing more songs. And even in the experience of slavery, they would sing songs that had these codified meanings behind it. Songs like Heaven, everyone talking about heaven ain't going there. That was like a dig at the slave master who would go Sunday morning on Sabbath to his church, come back and beat the slave. Frederick Douglass said he hated Sunday the worst because he would get the worst beating from the master. He felt all pious in what he was doing, like beating the devil out. Lord, why come me here? Steal away to Jesus. We talk about that, and in Jesus we generally think of, well, he's talking about going to Jesus, and yes, but they're also talking about escaping, being able to get away. These were code songs that were oftentimes used to share. Songs like Wade in the Water, wade in the water, little children, God's gonna trouble the water. What was it talking about? Well, some people say we're talking about baptism, but we would look at it historically and say, well, get in the water so the dogs won't be able to follow you. So it's like a dualism that is there. The bloodhounds can't track you in the water. So wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. Go down Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go. Coming down to Mississippi, trying to lead people up to freedom. And all these different various songs, they had their life, their meaning that was behind it to try to encourage and to continue to give them hope, because hope was the one thing that was desperately needed. Lastly, when you look at the experience that is there, we take a couple of lessons away from it. And we won't go through all these because of our time, nor the transition of how these songs still are around. I'll just put in a quick note. You will certainly want to look up the Fifth Jubilee singers and their contribution to being able to help the spirituals to be able to survive, as well as the Hampton singers too. Well, the Bible tells us in closing in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 15. Paul says, what is it then? I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also, and I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. I want to leave us with those things, that in the experience, one of the things that the slaves found is that they wanted to pray and to sing with the Spirit, with passion, with understanding. That in the worship of God, that we want to bring that forth to Him, that our heart be involved in it. That it's not merely a head knowledge, but it's also the heart experience. And this is what they were seeking to be able to bring over, that in many times was questioned. For God is King of the earth, sing profound praises to Him. He is worthy. He's worthy to be praised because He is King of the earth. He's done some mighty things in your life and some mighty things in my life. And we ought to give Him glory. We ought to give Him recognition for those things. And so as you do so, to be able to bring forth with the Spirit and bring forth with the understanding. It can't be bottled up. It can't be passionate and held in. It's like the experience of the man who had been healed by Jesus. After Jesus healed him, they went out and they brought him to the temple. And they're like, who healed you? And the man was like, it's this man, describing Jesus. And they looked, and they didn't want to give God the glory. They said, well, let's bring in his parents and so forth. And his parents were afraid to answer. But the man could not be silent because God had done a miracle in his life. And so he went out continuing to tell people about what God had done for him. So may we also leave out to be able to go out and to share and to tell in what God has done for us. So we may sing with the Spirit and we may sing with the understanding also. Father in heaven, we thank you for the time we've been able to study and to share today. I pray that you would be with us and give us a new experience today. Even though sometimes where we have come from, what we have endured may not be understood by others, it's not necessarily important because you understand, you know what we've been through. When other human beings have not been around, you've been there. When we've been left by ourselves, down at our lowest, you've been there. Even on the highest, you've been there. Every step of the way, you've been there. So we want to give you the praise and glory. We want to sing to your praise, your goodness. And so I pray that you would help us to not be silent, to never be silent. May our tongue be to the roof of our mouth, that we get to give you the praise and the glory whereby you are due. Bless and keep us, I pray. Continue to be a light to lead us out of the darkness.